which two of you wrote about. Very proud of you. I read them, but I didn't grade them because we haven't talked about them yet. But Bartolomé he's actually existing between two separate spaces. He's born in Spain, he's born as a slave owner, and then he's brought over here and he meets individuals that are indigenous people, and he almost enters into a new framework because he allows their construction of social meaning and their experience to speak to him. And then what does he do? He takes his spiritual power. I'm a priest who lives in line with God, and he doesn't use it to protect, he does in the beginning, but later on, he doesn't use it to protect himself and what would benefit him as a white Spaniard, but he uses it to articulate and advocate for them. And that's how these things are happening, and that's how he's negotiating these things, which is super cool. And so all I meant to say from all this is that all of this here is not the power structure itself, it's what makes these things possible. So when we get to Bartolomé de Las Casas, we see that he was born in Spain, as I said. So imagine the construction that he's born into. We're Spain. A big thing in Europe around this time is like, we are the holy leaders of Rome, and Rome doesn't mean like I'm Italian and I like I guess pizza and meatballs. It means like dog, like we run the Catholic Church. Like this is our thing, right? And so his first interaction with indigenous peoples, to speak about how this is constructed for him, is actually when Columbus brings back people, like indigenous people, the first time. So there's 7 people that are brought back to Europe, and he sees them, he says. And his father, Pedro de Las Casas, but I typoed Pedro Pascal, goes on.
That's so cool.
It is so cool.
Helmet and all.
Dude, it would be so hard, but it would also be horrible because it's colonization, but also hard. So he goes on the second Columbus expedition. And so in 1499, de Las Casas is 15, he's a kid, right? Pedro brings his son a gift, which is a young Amerindian. That's the way this person grows up. So a lot of people are very critical of de Las Casas. I understand, fam, and I get it. But if you grew up as a 15-year-old, with being one of the first person in Europe gifted an Amerindian slave, like to go where he goes from that point, like that's your origin story. No, that's nuts. Anyway, in 1502, at age 18, he immigrates to Hispaniola. That's where they are in Haiti, where he becomes a haciendo, or a slave owner. He participates in slave raids on the native Taino peoples. Now, in 1506 to 1507, he returns to Spain to complete his studies, and he's ordained a secular priest in 1507. What does secular priest mean? This is before secularization, so it's not like secular, like not religious, like we mean it. That means like he's a priest of a space. That's what, like I'm a priest of that island or this place or this little region. In 1510, he returns to Santo Domingo, and he argues against Montesinos. Montesinos was a friar who was like to use the language, he's like the OG of people of Spanish people who were arguing for the fair treatment of indigenous slaves. And so Montesinos argues this in 1510. He says to the Spanish, "Tell me by what right of justice do you hold these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude? On what authority have you waged such detestable wars against these people who dealt quietly and peacefully on their own lands? Wars in which you have destroyed such an infinite number of them by homicides and slaughters never heard of before. Why do you keep them so oppressed and exhausted without giving them enough to eat or curing them of the sickness that they incur by the excessive labor you give them and they die, or rather you kill them in order to extract gold every day?" Now, what he's doing from 1510, really from 1507, but really from 1510 to 1513, Bartolomé de Las Casas is arguing against Montesinos. He hears Montesinos say this, and he's like, "Bro, get out of here, bro. Like, God wants us to be oppressing these people. It's part of our Christian duty to make Spain strong." So what do we learn here? Remember how I said spiritual power is negotiated? He has a peer in Montesinos who's arguing against him. He's arguing to protect his, it's not really white, it is white, but it's really a Catholic Spanish superiority, and he's gleaning from these things, and he's protecting his spiritual power against the oppressed in order to preserve the hegemony, the power structure that he's benefiting from. Now, here's what I'll say. I study spiritual abuse. You all know this. In all my time doing this, I have seen very few people have spiritual power, have the ability to grab others in that socially constructed system of religious and political and racial hierarchy. I've seen very few people have that and give up that power to benefit the oppressed, or give up that power at their own expense. And you've been in a background like that. That never happens unless it's forced. And even if it is forced, those people, and I will call them cockroaches, they find a way to crawl back into those spaces. Happens all the time. Familiar with Mark Driscoll, if you're familiar with Darren Patrick, he ended up killing himself. But these people all found their way back into the pulpit. This guy, he never really leaves the pulpit because of the way the Spanish work, but he actually switches sides. And that doesn't happen in the DR and Haiti, which is Hispaniola. That actually happens in Cuba. And this begins to change. And this is why I don't know that I formulated an opinion about De Las Casas. A lot of people have been talking about him in religious discourse and scholarship for a while. A lot of people hate him because it's something that I'll bring up in a minute. But I think we have to be fair with people. I have a mom, well, I have a mom, but I have older people in my life, and what I've learned is that people change very slowly. You're brought up in this social construction, and to get you from, let's say, a 2 out of 10 that you were brought up into to a 4 out of 10 might take 70 years. But 70 years, you go from a 20-year-old to a 90-year-old. Like, that's going to take your whole life. Now, he begins to change in 1513, but as real change happened, it's not performative, it's not nonsense. The way humans work, it happens slowly, painfully, incrementally, and it starts in Cuba. And so he witnesses there many atrocities committed by the Spaniards against the native peoples who were there, and he writes later on, I saw here a cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see. It's around this time that he started to say, like, what are we doing? And remember, this is the same guy who argued against Montesinos, an advocate of the native peoples in Hispaniola. So in 1514, he's preparing for a sermon, and he's pondering its meaning. It's out of Ecclesiastes 34, which is in the Apocrypha for Catholics. It's not in the text for regular Protestants or people who follow another type of Bible. But you can get the same thing from other verses in the Bible, right? And so at this point, reading the sermon and introspecting, he's finally, at the very least, partially convinced that all the actions of the Spanish have been illegal, unjust, and sinful. And so it's at that time that he does what I think the meaning of repentance in his construct means. It doesn't mean just to stop doing what you're doing, but to go the opposite direction. So he gives up his slaves, stops doing what he says is wrong, and then he starts to compel others to do the same. So he gets back in the pulpit, he gets back in spaces that he's allowed to teach others about Jesus, and he says, hey, y'all own slaves, that is sinful, God hates that. And this is a world where, remember, it's not like today where you have Joe Biden and then you have the church separately or whatever. These things are the same. The church is what's making the king the king. Spaniards are seen as Catholics. Catholics are seen as Spaniards. In fact, you had to be a Spaniard. In order to be a Spaniard, you had to be a Catholic and baptized in the church. That's how they did censuses back then. So from this point on, he continues to fight for the rights of indigenous peoples throughout his career and his life. And so he writes multiple treaties and in defense of these negative, in defense of the very people that he started off owning. So imagine being a 15-year-old slave owner. And then by the time you're around my age, you give up all of that. You give up the lands, the property in your eyes that you have been taught your whole life because of your religious experience. And then you go and you begin to be an advocate for them. Now, as I've said, he is not without, that's not the right time, is it?
I think that's off that computer.
It's 31.
Bro, I was mad anxious. I thought it was 3:43. I was like, 7 minutes and 3 slides. But I'm doing great. So anyway, so he has the power to liberate, but he's still ignorant. And here's the thing, right? This is where he gets into trouble. Now, De Las Casas is not without controversy. He had a plan early in 1517 to 1520. He dies in like 1560, right? So he's still a young man at this time. To reform the encomiendas, which is where they would own slaves. You would have an encomiendo, he would own the slaves, and you live on the encomienda with everyone who lived on the encomienda, right? And what he wanted to do was move the enslaved peoples, the indigenous ones, to self-governing townships. And he tried to justify this to the king, because remember, when you're doing real advocacy, you can't move people from a 1 to a 10. I'm telling you, unless you want to burn down all of society, which De Las Casas definitely didn't want to do as a Spanish priest, you have to kind of move people slowly, you know? And so what he tries to do is he said, okay, well, I need to justify this to the king. How can I make this attractive to him? All right, well, we can move the indigenous people to self-governing townships and make them pay tribute like anyone else in the Spanish Empire. Now, modern people read that and they're like, yeah, bro, he was still wanting to extract and colonize and blah, 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 blah. 100%. He was a Spaniard in the 1500s. What the hell did you expect him to do? At the very least, he didn't want them to be slaves. And again, remember, change happens slowly. Now, he suggested that the loss of indigenous labor could be replaced. Now, at the time, there was this idea. If I beat you in a just war, so if I'm the Spanish and you're the Portuguese and we happen to have a beef, like in Angola, and in Angola, I whoop your ass and I win, I can take you as a slave because I beat you in the war and you're basically a prisoner of war. There's a way for you to get out of it sometimes, but this also is the way that Spaniards at the time are looking at their African slaveholders. This is where he gets in a lot of trouble, and this is extremely messed up, and this is something that's basically, we'll see what he says about it later, right? So he says, this loss of indigenous labor could be replaced on the encomienda by allowing the importation of African and white slaves. Now, again, that's screwed up, right? This is seen as problematic, and this probably contributed to a lot of realities we see today. There's some scholars that I read that said, yeah, this is what allowed 4,000 Africans to be brought over to Cuba and so on and so forth. And then there's other scholars who say, if he had written, like, they basically contest this using, like, by the time he wrote it, it wouldn't have gotten to Spain, which wouldn't have gotten those Africans back. Yeah.
So the African and white slaves were the ones who lost the war, and he brought them to.
He argued that the encomiendas could be reformed by allowing the importation of white and African slaves.
So like prisoners of war.
Yeah, but the truth is that the Africans weren't real prisoners of war.
Yeah,
the Spanish just saw it as a just war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, we know today it wasn't a just war. And later on in his life, you got to think about it. Like, today you could look up Nigerian Igbo TikTok. If you're familiar with Toby Nguibi and his music, incredible. But from there, your algorithm on social media will very quickly go into other Igbo peoples, which are from Nigeria, and so you'll get connected to that. That happens like this, and most of you don't even realize it. Back in the day, to get from Spain to the New World took months. And so news didn't travel that fast. And so you just kind of went off of what other people had. I'm not trying to say that's a justification for his solution. I'm just trying to explain where he's at. Now, here's what I will say. In one of his later works, this is like we don't know when this happens, but it's probably in the 40s, 50s, or 60s, right towards the end of his life, he realizes the ignorance of this sentiment about African and white slaves. And this has to be genuine because he's writing this for him, you know. So he says this, in History of the Indies, he writes, I soon repented and judged myself guilty of ignorance. I came to realize that black slavery was as unjust as Indian slavery, as indigenous slavery. And I was not sure that my ignorance and good faith would secure me in the eyes of God. And so what he realized towards the end of his life, maybe the last 10, 15 years, was, how can I argue for the indigenous people and say, hey, we can't enslave them, and then say that that we can replace them with African slavery? He realizes that war was unjust and all those implications. Yeah.
But don't you think during that time, the same African kings were giving up the African people as slaves? So they saw it as something good because if Africa's king is doing it,
sure.
Why can't we just take them as slaves?
I think so, but I don't know that that's a justification, because when we talk about colonization and imperialism and stuff like that, we have to talk about the distinction between different powers, right? So when you have, there's different levels of abuse, and we see this in the church. So when a congregate in a church sexually abuses another congregate, that's horrible. When a priest does it, it's a little bit different. Why is it a little bit different?
Because he has more power.
Yeah. So Spain had a hell of a lot more power than those African kings. Now, the richest man in all of history was an African man. It was Mansa Musa, and he mainly traded slaves. And that's not to take away from the pain there. But what ends up happening when those African kings would take slaves and participate in this super unjust system, I don't think those people had the racial understanding that would come later in the 1700s. I think they were just taking slaves. And when we talk about slavery and racism today, we're talking about those social constructions, right? They didn't know. Now, that doesn't forgive them for taking slaves. Taking slaves is horrible under any context. But I think that I think the Spanish that were taking those slaves, they saw it as a just war. Not that it justifies it, it doesn't. And it's actually an interesting point you bring up too, because a lot of times you can do stuff and be like, on the scale of how bad this is a 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10. But then there's unforeseen consequences that happen years later. It's like, I shouldn't hook up with this girl at the club. Then you hook up with a girl at the club, she gets pregnant, now you have a kid, and the solution is you raise a kid, be an absent father, or you abort that human. Like, you didn't think about that when you were at 11, but now you're there, you know what I'm saying? So I think there's something there to that. That was a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. Now, what I was brought here to talk about was this, which is
There's a hand over there.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know if any of the slaves participated in the wars? In the American Civil War, some slaves participated.
I think so. I know that in European conflicts in African states, particularly when you look at the Portuguese and Angola, of course they would recruit slaves to fight. But what power do those slaves have?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, it's to use a church example, if a 40-year-old pastor tells a 15-year-old, hey, work for free for 15 hours a week, that behind that question, the 15-year-old can give consent, but he doesn't have the conception of power that is being wielded over him. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, a lot of times those slaves were prisoners of war in the eyes of the Spanish, but they still wouldn't have been seen as Europeans. You know, and later on, and I might be wrong on this, but white slaves are given freedoms and the ability to get free, and darker slaves or even mixed slaves, depending on the space of the Caribbean, is a diverse place with the colonizers and the culture and so on and so forth, they're not given as many options. So you can even see that, and you see the impacts of that way later. Like, even later when Gran Colombia is like established, and Gran Colombia is like there's a racial hegemony that exists because of that social construction of power. So am I right on that? Because you know a hell of a lot more than I do about that.
Yeah, Joey.
Proud of myself.
I mean, it's hard.
I'm giving a lecture in
It's a
front of
deep
me.
dive, and we don't really have time to go into all the supply side of the slave trade, but there's a lot to it.
Now, in the last 10 minutes, in what many would consider his greatest work, Las Casas leverages his spiritual power to advocate for the indigenous peoples who were being brutalized by the Spanish. And we know this because the opening line of a short account of the destruction of the West Indies, which is that text that you all are supposed to read portions of, written to the Crown Prince Philip of Spain, he doesn't say, hey, it's politically wrong that you're doing this. He says, as a priest, God is going to judge Spain because you are committing atrocities and sin against this people group. And this is at an earlier time before the conceptions of race become what they are in the 1600s. This is written in the 1500s. And by the way, Catholicism is a disaster at this point because the Reformation that happened earlier, they're having the Council of Trent, so like Catholicism is reforming itself. No one knows what up is, down is, but Bartolomé de Las Casas, he knew, hey, I'm going to fight for these people. That's what I'm about. And that's kind of what he dedicated his life to. So he writes here, and I'll tell you two stories. This is kind of how the whole text works. I know all of you read it in its entirety in 2 days, which I know you did. But I'll tell you some stories, because I think it's amazing. Now, Las Casas says that the native people of the Yucatan region experienced 7 years of violence committed in the name of God by a band of 30 Spaniards who self-identified as Christians to the native people. We got to understand this. Today, you are an American who happens to be a Protestant, a Catholic, an atheist. Back in the day, that's not how it worked. You would pull up and say, I am a Catholic under the appointed king of God in Spain. That's the way you would identify. And so Spaniards were Catholics, Catholics were Spaniards. That's the way they saw it and they communicated to other people. And that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it helps modern readers understand that. Now, after 7 years of violence, these 30 Spaniards, let's call them conquistadors, who had been presenting God as complicit in their abuses, that party stopped all those abuses for a short time. During that time, 4 Franciscan friars endeavored to share the message of their God to the native people that survived the cultural abuse. So those 30 band of Spaniards pillaging, raping, doing all this stuff, they leave. And then in that time, when they leave, 4 priests come. And those 4 priests are like, hey, let's talk to people about God, which is what priests do, right? And at first, the surviving people, the surviving indigenous peoples, questioned what made these friars different than the other Christians. And they stopped them from entering their territory. And after spending time gaining trust, those 4 friars were allowed to share their message and live alongside the people, provided they ensured no Spaniards would come along with them. So, as long as it's just you 4, who we trust as indigenous people, you can come and share anything. But if those people come back, you gotta go. Those 4 friars write to the governor, the viceroy, and say, hey, this is the deal. Can you make sure these people don't come back? The viceroy says, yeah, you can go in. I'll make sure these people don't come back and rape, pillage, and murder. Which we'll find out later, that was a lie. So these people are allowed to go in. Now, Las Casas states that the friars were so effective in their treating of their people that within 40 days, those people offered their carved idols to their gods to be burned. They entrusted their friars with the education of their children. Following this, the surviving native peoples erected schools, invited neighboring people groups to learn from the friars about this new god. And around that time, even though those friars have been successful in their evangelistic opportunity, which brings up all sorts of its own issues, but you get the idea, those same group of 30 pillaging, marauding Spaniards come back. And they basically violate that agreement that they had made with the viceroy. And those 30 Spanish abusers brought with them idols from other villages. So they brought back those false gods. You gotta understand from a Catholic perspective, these fake gods, we brought back idols that we stole made of jade and things like that from these other villages. And they coerced the native people, right, that they had been pillaging before, that the governor said they'd never come back, that the friars were in their trust with, to buy those idols at the price of 1 slave per idol. So it's a negotiation, but it's not a negotiation. We're Spanish conquistadors. I'll give you 1 idol, but you got to give me 1 slave. And that's kind of the deal that they have. And so the native peoples were forced, and if you want to think about it this way, to buy back the very idols they gave up because those friars had humanized them. This is all from the language of De Las Casas, so read it with a grain of salt. But again, this is how you did advocacy back then. And the 30 Spaniards had lied and said that they did it at the behest of the friars. And this is kind of what he writes. This is an English translation of it. Once the local people saw that the undertaking given by the missionaries, that they would ensure the Spaniards would be excluded from the territory, had not been honored, and that it was those same Spaniards who now brought idols to make them buy, after all they had surrendered their own gods to their friars, in return for the promise that they could worship one single Catholic God, they were beside themselves. And as one man, as one group, they rose in revolt against the missionaries. They don't take it out on the conquistadors, they take it out on the missionaries, who were good guys in this story, ambiguously good guys. And they said, "Why did you lie to us? Why did you trick us with your promise that you would keep the Spaniards out of our territories? Why did you burn our gods when you knew that they would bring us others from other parts of the country which you would have to buy? Were not our own gods better than those of other people?" And this is a really interesting story because you still see kind of the flawed nature of 15th century Spanish advocacy, right? Like, he wanted them to accept Catholicism, so he was, these friars were articulating this to them, but at the same time, they had kind of ushered in a new form of abuse. Now, another and the final form of this, which I'll share in the last 5 minutes of class, is a famous tribal leader. Have you all ever had that drink called Hathaway? You know what I'm talking about? It has like the little indigenous person on it. Well, that's actually named after this guy, which is really cool. And this is his writing. This is De Las Casas quoting Hathaway from earlier in his life. Like, when he writes this, it's 30 years later, but Hathaway had such an impact on him that he remembered him. So this is what De Las Casas remembers about this. He says, rumor has it that the Christians are coming to this island. This is a native tribal leader. And you already know what they have done to Lord so-and-so. What they did on Haiti, they will do here again. Does any of you know why it is that they behave this way? And when they answered him, his people answered him, "No, unless it is that they are innately cruel and evil." This is the native people speaking about the Spaniards. He replied, "It's not simply that. They have a God whom they worship and adore. And it is in order to get that God from us that they can worship him, that they conquer us and they kill us." He had beside him, as he spoke, a basket filled with gold and jewelry. And he said, "Here is the God of the Christians. If you agree, we will do a traditional dance to appease this God, so that we can please this God of gold, and he will order the Christians to leave us unharmed." And that is such like a clean way of rebuking Spain and rebuking these native peoples. Following this, the group danced, and they did it to appease the God of gold the Spanish worshipped. And then they threw the gold in the river, thinking that the Spaniards wouldn't come after them. Las Casas states that after this, though Hathaway had committed no crime, the Spanish captured him and sentenced him to death. And this is the hardest moment in the entire Caribbean. At his execution, another Catholic friar shared the Catholic faith with Hathaway and said that if Hathaway believed when he died he would go to heaven. Las Casas remarks that Hathaway, he's witnessing this years earlier, considered it for a time, and then asked that priest if Christians go to heaven, which is a very interesting thing to ask at your death. So, you're going to get killed, and there's friars there, like, I think Red Dead 2 style, like, you want to accept Jesus before you die. And when the friar responds to Hathaway, he says, "Well, the good Christians go to heaven." Hathaway says the hardest thing of all time. If it's the case that good Christians go to heaven, then I choose to go to hell to ensure that I never have to look at these cruel brutes ever again. That's the hardest shit ever. And then he dies. Now, why do I tell that story? Because, what Casas says is this is just one example of the reputation and honor that the Spanish, that you as a king, know. That our Lord, our Christian faith have endured as a result of the act of those Christians who have sailed to the Americas. So, what do we see here? We see a person who had enormous power. And we see that person walk away from that and then do his best his whole life to articulate a different view of essentially the earliest form of advocacy that we have for slaves and indigenous people. Not the earliest, because Montesinos was before him, but this is one of the most effective, because he's going back and forth to Spain, he's going all around the Caribbean, and he's saying, I have a first-hand view. He literally gets called the protector of the Indians. They call them Indians because the West Indies, that whole thing, right? And I think that when we look at Las Casas, we look at a very flawed person like anyone else, but we're looking at someone I think is a hero, because he really is fighting for people at a time when it would have been very easy for him to be like you think it would have been easier for him to just be like, yo, King of Spain and everybody else, yeah, God wants us to do this. But instead, he's using that religious power to advocate for these people. And I say this in my intro class all the time. We think that religion is an enemy of the oppressed, and oftentimes it is. But at the same time, it has a second face. And the second face is the face of advocacy. And that's what you see here. And I think that's what makes this first week so important for this class. And this is why we decided to start with De Las Casas, because De Las Casas is an imperfect figure. He's a figure that shows you kind of the two faces of Spanish Catholicism in the Caribbean. On one end, it's the hand that beats and oppresses and says, you're not enough, you're not a person X, Y, Z. On the other hand, you have this guy saying, hey man, let's for these religious reasons let people in. Now I wanted to tie this all back to the very first thing you saw in this class, which I'm sure was as shocking for you as it was for me, which was when Dr. Joe, my good friend, and not colleague, because I don't think we're peers, but whatever he is, Christian to me, he played those pictures, remember, of Pentecostalism in the Caribbean, and he asked you, what's normal? We all saw it, we didn't say it. And then he said it. He said what?
They're all black.
Exactly. Who holds spiritual power now in the Caribbean?
Black people.
Yeah. Do you understand how insane that is, given this history? That's absolutely wild. And one of the things we're going to discover and discuss in this class going forward is how religion can be a vehicle for liberation. A lot of times, it honestly hasn't. Anyway, that was my lecture.